The Life of Immigrants in 1921 Challenges, Prejudice, and Hope. In 1921, America slammed the golden door shut. The Emergency Quota Act changed immigration forever. But for millions already here, the real struggle was just beginning. Discover the brutal reality of Ellis Island inspections, the nightmare of tenement life, and the hatred immigrants faced from the country they dreamed of calling home. From chalk marks that destroyed dreams, to children who became bridges between two worlds. This is the untold story of immigrant survival in America's most hostile year. But before embarking on this journey, leave a like, activate the notification bell, and subscribe to the channel. In 1921, a ship arrived at Ellis Island, carrying 900 passengers. By the end of the day, 87 of them had been marked with Shaka single letters scrawled on their coats. L for lameness, E for eyes, X for mental defect. These letters were death sentences for dreams. Those marked would be detained, examined, and often sent back to countries they had sold everything to escape. They called Ellis Island the Island of Hope. They also called it the Island of Tears. Tonight, we step through those gates into 1921, the year America decided who deserved to be American. On May 19, 1921, President Warren Harding signed the Emergency Quota Act into law. For the first time in American history, the government set numerical limits on who could enter the country, and those limits were designed to keep certain people out. The message was clear. Some immigrants were welcome, others were not. Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks saw their numbers slashed by over 80%. The golden door was closing, but for the millions already here, the struggle had just begun. They lived in overcrowded tenements where sunlight never reached. They worked in factories where children lost fingers to machines. They faced hatred from Americans who saw them as invaders, criminals, and threats to the nation itself. Before an immigrant could face the challenges of America, they first had to survive the journey to reach it. In 1921, the Atlantic crossing remained a test of endurance that separated the hopeful from the broken. The wealthy traveled in first and second class private cabins, dining rooms with white tablecloths, promenades on open decks. These passengers would be processed aboard the ship itself, their papers checked by officials who came to them. They would never set foot on Ellis Island. But the vast majority of immigrants could not afford such luxury. They traveled in steerage, the lowest decks of the ship, below the waterline, where hundreds of people were packed into spaces designed for cargo. The bunks were stacked 3 high, separated by inches. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, vomit, and despair. Toilets were shared by hundreds. Fresh water was rationed. Meals consisted of whatever could be prepared in massive quantities and would not spoil during the 2-week voyage. Disease spread through steerage with terrifying speed. Typhus, cholera, and measles found easy victims among the weakened passengers. Those who died were buried at sea, their bodies wrapped in cloth and slipped over the side, while families watched from the deck above. Some ships arrived in New York Harbor with dozens fewer passengers than they had departed with. For those who survived, the first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty brought tears of relief and hope. They had made it. They had crossed the ocean. But the hardest part of their journey was about to begin. The Island of Tears. Ellis Island processed over 500,000 immigrants in 1921 alone. Each one faced an examination designed to determine a single question. Were they fit to become Americans? The process began the moment immigrants stepped off the ferry. Officials watched them climb the stairs to the Great Hall, looking for signs of lameness, shortness of breath, or difficulty walking. Those who struggled were pulled aside immediately. A chalk mark on their clothing indicated the suspected problem and the beginning of a nightmare. In the Great Hall, immigrants waited in long metal pens, shuffling forward inch by inch toward the inspection stations. Doctors examined eyes by flipping eyelids inside out with a procedure so painful that children screamed and adults fainted. They were searching for trachoma, an eye infection that guaranteed deportation. One study found that immigrants with trachoma were being sent back at a rate of over 6,000 per year. The mental examination was perhaps the cruelest test. Inspectors asked questions designed to confuse puzzles, arithmetic problems, questions about American history that most Americans could not answer. Those who seemed slow, confused, or simply did not understand English might be marked with an X and sent to the psychiatric ward for further evaluation. The line between mentally defective and terrified immigrant who does not speak English was impossibly thin. Approximately 2% of all arrivals were ultimately deported, sent back across the ocean they had just crossed, their dreams destroyed, their families often separated forever. 2% sounds small. In 1921, it meant over 10,000 people whose lives ended in that brick building in New York Harbor. Families were torn apart on Ellis Island. A husband might be admitted while his wife was detained for medical examination. Children might be separated from parents for days or weeks. Some families arrived together and never saw each other again. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 transformed immigration to America overnight. For the first time, the government imposed numerical limits based on national origin, and those limits revealed exactly who was considered desirable. The law restricted annual immigration from any country to 3% of the number of people from that country living in the United States in 1890. This date was chosen deliberately. In 1890, most immigrants had come from Northern and Western Europe, Britain, Germany, Scandinavia. By using that census, the quotas heavily favored those groups, while dramatically limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. The numbers tell the story of discrimination. Italy's annual quota dropped from over 200,000 to approximately 42,000. Poland fell from over 100,000 to fewer than 31,000. Russia collapsed from over 150,000 to around 24,000. Meanwhile, Britain received a quota of over 77,000, despite having far fewer people seeking to emigrate. The quota took effect in June of 1921, and the chaos was immediate. Ships racing to arrive before the monthly quotas were exhausted created a lottery of desperation. A ship arriving on June 1st might discharge all its passengers. A ship arriving on June 15th might find the quota already full, its passengers forced to return to Europe without ever touching American soil. Families who had planned for years, saved every penny, sold everything they owned, found themselves turned away because they arrived one day too late. But whether you're American or an immigrant, it's never too late to like and subscribe to the channel. The golden door had not just closed, it had been slammed shut in their faces. For those who made it through Ellis Island, America revealed itself, first in the tenements of New York, Chicago, Boston, and other major cities. These buildings would define the immigrant experience for a generation. The Lower East Side of Manhattan, in 1921, was the most densely populated place on Earth. Over 300,000 people per square mile lived in buildings designed for a fraction of that number. Families of 8 or 10 occupied single rooms. Border strangers who paid rent to sleep on floors or share beds were common, even in the most crowded apartments. Sunlight was a luxury that many tenement dwellers never experienced. Interior rooms had no windows. Air shafts, narrow gaps between buildings, supposedly designed to provide ventilation, became dumping grounds for garbage and breeding grounds for disease. The smell of rotting waste, unwashed bodies, and cooking from a dozen different cultures mixed into a permanent miasma that visitors found unbearable. Water came from shared pumps in hallways or courtyards. Toilets, when they existed indoors at all, were shared by entire floors. Bathing was a luxury accomplished in public bathhouses, or, for those who could not afford even that, in rivers that also served as sewers. Disease spread through these buildings with terrifying efficiency. Tuberculosis was so common in tenement districts that it was simply called the tenement disease. Yet within these impossible conditions, immigrants built communities. Each ethnic group clustered together: Italians in Little Italy, Jews on the Lower East Side, Poles in Chicago's back of the yards. They recreated the villages they had left behind, establishing churches and synagogues, mutual aid societies, newspapers in their native languages. The tenement was hell, but it was a shared hellland in that sharing. There was something like home. Immigrants in 1921 took jobs that native-born Americans refused. The dangerous, dirty, and degrading work that powered the American economy from below. The garment industry employed hundreds of thousands of immigrant workers, primarily women and children. They worked in sweatshops, cramped rooms, above storefronts, where sewing machines ran from dawn until long after dark. 12-hour days were standard. 14-hour days were common. Pay was calculated by the piece, not the hour, which meant that bathroom breaks and meals cost money. Just 10 years earlier, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire had killed 146 workers, who died because the factory doors had been locked to prevent breaks. By 1921, some reforms had been enacted, but conditions remained brutal. Fire escapes were still inadequate. Ventilation was still poor, and the economic pressure on immigrant families was still so intense that sending children to work seemed not just acceptable but necessary. Children as young as 5 worked in American factories in 19. They crawled under machinery to retrieve dropped materials. They sorted coal in mines, where the dust destroyed their lungs. They sold newspapers on street corners at midnight. Child labor laws existed in some states, but were rarely enforced in immigrant neighborhoods, where inspectors could be bribed and families depended on every penny. Men found work in construction, meatpacking, steel mills, and mining industries that consumed human bodies without sentiment. The steel mills of Pittsburgh operated around the clock, with 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were replaced immediately. Those killed by accidents were constantly received no compensation. Their families were simply evicted from company housing to make room for the next worker. The wages for this suffering were barely enough to survive. A skilled garment worker might earn $15 per week. An unskilled laborer might earn half that. Rent for a tenement room consumed a third of income. Food consumed another third. What remained was never enough for medicine, never enough for education, never enough for the escape that everyone dreamed of. The challenges of poverty and labor might have been bearable if immigrants had been welcomed by the nation they had sacrificed so much to reach. They were not. Anti-immigrant sentiment in 1921 had reached a fever pitch. Newspapers portrayed Southern and Eastern Europeans as criminals, anarchists, and carriers of disease. Political cartoons depicted Italians as knife-wielding criminals, Jews as hook-nosed conspirators, and Slavs as mentally inferior. These images were not marginal. They appeared in mainstream publications read by millions. The connection between immigration and crime was accepted as fact, despite evidence to the contrary. When Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Van, Italian immigrants and admitted anarchists, were arrested for murder in 1920, their trial became a national spectacle. The evidence against them was questionable at best, but their conviction seemed certain from the moment of their arrest. They were immigrants. They were radicals. In the America of 1921, that was enough. Employment discrimination was open and unashamed. Hell-wanted signs routinely specified no Italians, no Jews, or simply Americans only. Banks refused loans to immigrant entrepreneurs. Landlords outside ethnic enclaves refused to rent to foreign-born tenants. The message was consistent: you may work here, but you will never belong here. Violence against immigrants was common and rarely punished. In 1921, a wave of anti-Italian violence swept through several American cities. Homes were burned, businesses were destroyed. In one incident in West Virginia, an entire Italian neighborhood was driven out by an armed mob. Police watched without intervening. The Ku Klux Klan, experiencing a massive revival in the early 1920s, added Catholics and Jews to its list of targets alongside Black Americans. By 1924, the Klan would claim over 4 million members. Our channel also wants to reach 4 million subscribers, so subscribe and share this video. Only you can help us, and its anti-immigrant message would be embraced by much of mainstream American society. The bonds that held in the face of such hostility, immigrants survived through networks of mutual support that native-born Americans rarely understood. These bonds of family, ethnicity, religion, and neighborhood became the foundation of immigrant survival. The Italian system of campanilismo loyalty to those from one's home village meant that a newcomer from Sicily could find help from fellow Sicilians who had arrived years earlier. They would provide temporary housing, introduce newcomers to potential employers, explain the bewildering systems of American life. Similar networks existed among Jews through Landsmannschaft organizations, based on town of origin and Greeks, and other immigrant groups. Religious institutions provided both spiritual comfort and practical assistance. Catholic parishes established schools, hospitals, and orphanages that served immigrant communities. Jewish synagogues created charitable organizations that provided everything from burial services to interest-free loans. Churches conducted services in native languages, preserving cultural traditions that seemed in danger of extinction. The immigrant press flourished in over 1,000 foreign-languaged newspapers operated in the United States, providing news from home countries, practical advice for navigating American life, and a sense of connection to a broader community. The Jewish Daily Forward, published in Yiddish, reached a circulation of over 200,000, making it one of the largest newspapers in New York City. Perhaps most importantly, immigrants maintained hope through their children. The sacrifices they endured, the dangerous work, the crowded tenements, the hatred from their neighbors, were all justified by a single belief: their children would have better lives. Education was the key. Children who learned English, who succeeded in American schools, who escaped the tenements, they would redeem every moment of suffering their parents had endured. The children of immigrants occupied a strange position in American society: too American for their parents, too foreign for their classmates. Their experience would shape the nation for generations to come. In the public schools of 1921, immigrant children faced systematic pressure to abandon their heritage. Teachers forbade the use of foreign languages. Even during recess, textbooks celebrated Anglo-Saxon culture, while ignoring or denigrating the contributions of other groups. Children were taught to be ashamed of their parents' accents, their strange foods, their old country customs. The psychological toll was immense. Children learned to navigate between two worlds, speaking English at school and Italian or Yiddish at home, eating American food in public and traditional dishes in private, celebrating American holidays while secretly observing traditions their parents could not abandon. Many developed a permanent sense of not belonging anywhere, to transform to return to their parents' world, too marked to be fully accepted in America. Yet these children also became bridges. They translated for parents who never mastered English. They explained American customs and laws. They negotiated with landlords, employers, and officials. By the age of 10, many immigrant children had assumed responsibilities that would overwhelm most adults, and they did so without complaint, understanding that their family's survival depended on their competence. Some rejected their heritage entirely, anglicizing their names, moving away from ethnic neighborhoods, and severing ties with the old country. Others embraced it fiercely, becoming advocates for their communities and defenders of traditions under attack. Most found some middle ground, preserving what they could, adapting what they must, creating a new identity that was neither fully immigrant nor fully American. This generation, the children of 1921, would go on to fight in World War II, build the American middle class, and produce children and grandchildren who would forget the tenements, forget the discrimination, forget the chalk marks on Ellis Island. They would become simply American. The immigrants of 1921 are gone now. The tenements where they lived have been demolished or gentrified. The factories where they labored have been converted to apartments. Ellis Island is a museum where tourists take selfies in the Great Hall where their great-grandparents once stood trembling. But something of that year remains. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 did not just limit immigration rights, revealed something fundamental about America. This nation, built by immigrants, has always struggled with immigration. Each new wave faces suspicion, discrimination, and demands to prove their worthiness. Each generation of newcomers is told they are different from the immigrants who came before, more dangerous, less assimilable, more threatening to the American way of life. And each generation proves those fears wrong. The Italians, who were called criminals, raised children who became judges. The Jews, who were called radicals, raised children who became senators. The Poles, who were called mentally inferior, raised children who became scientists. The pattern repeats, generation after generation, because the pattern is the American story. The immigrants of 1921 did not know they were making history. They knew only that they had crossed an ocean, survived an island, and found themselves in a country that did not want them. They knew that their work broke their bodies, and their neighbors hated their faces. They knew that their children were ashamed of them, and their parents would never see them again. And still they stayed. Still they worked. Still they hoped, because hope, in the end, is not about probability. When you have sold everything to buy a ticket, when you have watched your homeland disappear over the horizon, when you have been marked with chalk and examined like livestock and told you do not belong, hope is all that remains. And sometimes, against all odds, Ope Zinog, the golden door was closing in 19, but for those who made it through before it shut, America would eventually become home. It just took longer than anyone had promised. History is not just about the famous and powerful. It is about the millions who crossed oceans in steerage, who lived in tenements without sunlight, who worked in factories that destroyed them, and who built a nation that their grandchildren would inherit. Subscribe to continue exploring these forgotten stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new journey into the past. Leave a comment telling us about your own family's immigration story. Share this video with someone who needs to remember where we came from. Our history has never been more important. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Until next time.